the work that I'm doing in Canada is really focused on Indigenous water rights, self-determination, and sovereignty. So the inherent water rights, we say inherent because they've always existed. They've existed since time immemorial, but they've been marginalized and repressed by colonial structures, right? I work on that from the angle of water, but in particular the idea of collaborative governance, of co-governance, to acknowledge Indigenous inherent rights and Indigenous authorities and Indigenous participation in making decisions about their own water.
In all the discussions we've had with Distilled, we've never had someone like you that is, adjacent to the water sector, however we define that, and also very engaged in Stockholm World Water Week with what I think is a very diverse group of stakeholders.
Water really is a gateway to a lot of different things. Water is on the agenda in a way that it was not in the past, and related to climate, but also just water as a foundation of economic security and everything. It's really a good place to be.
Well, welcome to the party.
Thank you.
Welcome to Distilled, brought to you by KTM. I'm your host, Will Sarni, CEO of Water Foundry and founder and general partner of Water Foundry Ventures. During each episode, we'll speak to global water leaders solving wicked water problems. We'll talk about their career, how they got started in the world of water, their perspective on key topics facing the water sector, and what is next going forward in the world of water. Today, our guest is a good friend, Richard Farthing-Nichol, who is the project manager at Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources in Canada. Richard, great to see you. Thanks for volunteering to be on Distilled. Looking forward to the conversation and sort of digging in on a few of the topics that we talked about, which is your origin story. So what have you been doing? You've got an interesting, fascinating background, and how did you navigate towards, and maybe that's the perfect word to use, the world of water, and talk a little bit about how we met at Stockholm World Water Week and some of the work you were doing as a young professional, and certainly what you're doing now. And at the end, we can touch on where you see things going from your perspective in Canada, but also the work that you're doing with respect to collective action, collaboration, and working with Indigenous communities, which is such a critical part of where water stewardship is going.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks for having me, Will. Pleasure to be on the podcast. My water origin story, it's a bit of a roundabout way, I think. But, I was thinking about that. And I think for most people, it's kind of a roundabout way to get into water in the water sector. So it's maybe not unique. I was born and raised, and I still live in a place where I'm very fortunate to be close to water at almost all times. The place in Canada where I live in Winnipeg, I'm just on the doorstep of the boreal forest. So there's, thousands of lakes and rivers, and that's always been a big part of my life. It's still a big part of my life. My favorite thing to do in the world is to be in the seat of a canoe and enjoying the backcountry, lakes and rivers that I live close to. So that's been a big part of our life for a long time. But as far as water as a career and getting into the water sector, that was never really part of the plan. I studied political science, and that's still something I'm very passionate about. And through that, I started to really focus on ideas of Indigenous politics, Indigenous governments, Indigenous self-determination. And that became something that I was really interested in, really passionate about, for a number of reasons. Academically, super interesting to think about the place that I live and the importance of reconciling with our colonial past and recognizing inherent Indigenous water rights. But also, I think as a non-Indigenous Canadian, I've always felt kind of a moral imperative to work on those issues. So that kind of shaped my early education, my early career. And through that, just because of the importance of land and water in the ideas of Indigenous self-determination, Indigenous governance, I started to get more and more into water work. And that became something that I became really interested in. And also where so much of this interesting work is happening, it's about watershed co-governance. It's about decision-making over water, and what Indigenous rights look like in that context. So that's really what I've been working on for the past number of years. And just through that, I became, I guess, part of the water sector, and then became more aware of the dizzying kind of complexity and all of the different angles and wonderful people and innovations and ideas that are part of that sector. And that's really been a joy for me to expand my horizons, especially over the past few years as I've started to work with, I'm a policy and governance guy, but working with engineers and entrepreneurs and folks like that who are all part of the water sector, and working on very different issues than my particular niche. And so you mentioned Stockholm World Water Week, so I want to touch on that as well. And that's how you and I became connected originally last year through Stockholm World Water Week. And I think just that, thinking about the complexity and all the wonderful people and the people who are kind of disruptors and innovators in the water sector, that experience was really a crystallization of that. And our work together was just, it was a treat.
Thanks for the background. I do love, and I increasingly see this as I speak to people, that they've got this natural connection to water, whether it's an ocean, lake, river, whatever it may be, and they appreciate the value of water from a recreational and ecosystem perspective, and that becomes essentially a gateway to intersect with their career that might be tangent, not exactly in the world of water, and having that overlap, that Venn diagram is really valuable and can really sort of enrich both ends of it, if you will. So yes, we did meet as part of Stockholm World Water Week. Tell me a little bit about that experience. And the reason I'm asking is that, in all the discussions we've had with Distilled, we've never had someone like you that is, adjacent to the water sector, however we define that, and also very engaged in Stockholm World Water Week with what I think is a very diverse group of stakeholders, that are practicing in the world of water, NGOs and corporations and tech startups and so on. So if you can talk a little bit about being a young professional.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, it really is it was my first time attending World Water Week, and I think it really is a special event. I mean, I'm always, and I think a lot of people think about and maybe struggle with these questions. Okay, so we're convening this big gathering, the biggest water conference in the world. There's so many perspectives, different aspects of the sector represented, and there's always a question of kind of, so what? Like, what are we doing, or what's coming out of this, right? and of course, when you add in the complexities of international travel and are we getting what we want out of this gathering? And I think for me, I don't know, I hope this is not a cop-out, but it is really just about being together, and it's about learning from one another, and everybody's taking away something different from it. So rather than, focusing on what's the big tangible outcome of this gathering, there's countless tangible and intangible outcomes for, I think, every person who's part of it. And for me, it was really just, as I said, kind of expanding my horizons of the water sector. And we had, the interactions with governments who are really focused on policy, and that's really more my wheelhouse. But then you had corporates, of course, you had entrepreneurs, you had utilities, and all of these different folks who, even though the experience and the expertise was very different, could all speak to one another. And as you say, the water is, in the work I do as well around collaborative governance, water really is a gateway to a lot of different things. For us, it's a gateway to governance conversations that go far beyond water. And for a gathering like World Water Week, it's a gateway to, I mean, all of the different nexus issues that are part of water, and that water is really the foundation of. So, yeah.
Most people would agree these days that post-pandemic, it's really about getting together with people and collaborating and learning through that set of experiences. And, you and I mean, we talked about catalytic communities. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the ability to get together and craft something that takes us forward with respect to water and is just not perpetuating the status quo is such a high value component of going to Stockholm Water Week or some other events, and really having that interpersonal connection and ability to brainstorm on a real-time basis. I love what you're doing with respect to Indigenous communities and collaboration. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like in Canada? And as you do your work in Canada, do you look at what's going on in the U.S. For comparative purposes, and thinking about in particular what's happening in the American West? Access to water rights by Indigenous communities in the Southwest, and so on. So, if you can just give us an overview of what you're doing in Canada, and then to the extent you can, how it compares with what you're seeing in the U.S.
Yeah. What the work that I'm doing in Canada is really focused on, I mean, writ large, it's water governance, but really what we're focused on, a couple of things, I guess, and very related things. One is Indigenous water rights, self-determination, and sovereignty. So the inherent water rights, we say inherent because they've always existed, and they've existed since time immemorial, but they've been marginalized and repressed by colonial structures, right? And we're at, in Canada and other places perhaps as well, but certainly in Canada, we're at a point where the idea of reconciliation, so reconciling with our colonial past and really figuring out what that looks like moving forward in terms of Indigenous water rights and Indigenous rights more generally, is really kind of, we're at a pivotal point, but it's not going to be a quick process. It's a multi-generational process. And so there's that kind of dominant discourse, and I work on that from the angle of water, but in particular the idea of collaborative governance, of co-governance, which basically means taking kind of the status quo entrenched institutions, processes, policies, and laws that make up governance, which make up just how we make decisions about water, and how those can be changed, and changed in a meaningful way, to acknowledge Indigenous inherent rights and Indigenous authorities and Indigenous participation in making decisions about their own water. So that looks very different across Canada. This is the challenge with of course, there's always learnings you can draw from different places in Canada, but the US and other places around Indigenous water rights. But there's so much complexity there as well, even just jurisdiction by jurisdiction across Canada. There's things like some places have treaties that date back from the 19th century that really are the foundation for the governance of land and waters. Other places don't have treaties, so the land is not ceded. And that creates kind of this whole edifice of different laws and policies that to some extent you're constrained to working within if you're trying to change them. So yes, we there's always a comparative analysis and looking at learnings from different places, but also and I know it's so contextual. It's so contextual based on just the particular geography. So,
that's interesting. Being a good American, I viewed this issue in a uniform manner in Canada. I didn't have an appreciation that it is very location specific, and the legal arrangements, if any, can differ quite a bit depending on where you're located. So, not to spend too much time on comparing Canada to the U.S., but are there any good practices in the U.S. in terms of dealing with, what I view and many others view likely as a very difficult reconciliation of rights and so on? It sort of seems, maybe rightfully so, that the U.S. is very slow to evolve and address some of these issues. But I don't know, what's your take in terms of comparing the U.S. to Canada over at a high level?
Yeah, I think in some ways they're topic dependent for sure, but in some ways the structure in the U.S. and the tribal lands, there are ways that the sovereignty of tribal authority over their lands is perhaps more advanced in Canada in some ways, and in other ways not. I mean, yeah, it's a difficult question because it is there is so much diversity between the obviously massive geographies, but there's examples in certain locales in Canada that you can point to in which really transformational things have happened around who has authority over headwaters and watershed management. And that's between Indigenous governments and municipal governments, where appropriate, depending on the jurisdiction, also with provincial governments. And things have happened in the States as well. I know there was a interesting example from Albuquerque in New Mexico, where the city has been very proactive in recognizing of the tribal sovereignty that are adjacent to them. And really, I think the key is that they recognize it, but then they don't have a prescription for what that should actually look like to codify it into policy. But it's recognizing it and then working with neighboring tribes to figure out what that looks like. So there are pockets, I would say, in both places, but it's difficult to make a big comparison between the countries.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Richard, this is a global audience, and as much as you and I talked about Canada versus the U.S., for those folks elsewhere in the world, can you give us some specifics in Canada in terms of, one or two locations? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? What's the path forward? So, just kind of give us a few details for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, when you think about kind of Indigenous water rights in Canada, but also globally, I mean, at its core, it's really about principles that are enshrined in the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples around free and prior informed consent, around self-determination, and also the ability and the right of Indigenous peoples to participate in decisions that impact them. And so that's kind of a universal aspirational goal. And in Canada specifically, what that looks like, I mean, from the municipal, provincial or state level up to the federal level, there's kind of different opportunities and policy levers and legislative processes that you can reform and change to reach those principles and bring them into action. And so one thing is, it's not exactly completely, deconstructing the structures of the state, but is to say that if there's the federal government is working on legislation that impacts the source water of Indigenous communities, that maybe traditionally we can say is federal jurisdiction. And this is a real example because there's a bill right now called the Safe Water or Clean Water Drinking Act, that it's not just the federal government drafting legislation and then doing an engagement process, with Indigenous governments. It's actually Indigenous governments and the federal government co-developing that legislation. It's still federal legislation, but there's two hands on the pen when that legislation is being drafted. So that's one example. But also, if you go right down to the granular, the watershed level, there's really great examples. One you can think of is on Vancouver Island on the west coast of Canada, the Couch and Water Board, of municipal and Indigenous governments working together to figure out how you change decision making actually at the watershed level, that recognizes different cultural values, that recognizes different priorities of Indigenous and municipal governments. And then you get into really tangible, sometimes sticky questions about, land use and zoning and those sorts of things. So it's really multi-level kind of approach. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. And I wrote down two hands on the pen.
I stole that. That's not, I didn't.
No, you don't need to say that. I just stole it from you. So, no, I love that. Yeah, I love that. That is going to stick. Yeah, we'll talk about who you poached it from at another time. But I'm going to borrow it with pride from you. Any of the parts of the world that do it really well, That's the wrong way to put it. But in terms of, righting the wrongs that have plagued us through history.
Yeah, I mean,
you're a scholar on the topic, so what would you pick as maybe not perfect, but most advanced in terms of just leading on this issue?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's one methodology in particular that we use in our work. So I'm a project manager at the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources, as you know, and we have one of our main projects it's called Collaborative Leadership Initiative. And it's about bringing elected leaders from Indigenous governments and municipal governments to work together on a collaborative decision-making table on shared water challenges. And there's a big structure around that. It's a facilitated process. And actually where we've derived a lot of the learnings for how to structure that is not specifically a water issue, but it's post-apartheid South Africa, when these ideas of reconciliation, of course, were completely at the fore, and the societal kind of grappling with the trauma of the past, and then how do you reconcile collectively with that, and then what does the future look like? And so what they did, one of the main drivers in that time in South Africa post-apartheid, was called transformational scenario planning. And it's basically envisioning the future collectively, and a structured way of doing that, and is bringing people together kind of in a safe space to do that together. And that process was, it was really important in the reconciliation process in South Africa. And so we've taken that lesson and we've adapted it to the Canadian context to figure out, it's very difficult. It's people, institutions, and it's individuals, right, who need to deal with these challenging histories. Yeah.
Yeah, humanity's tough, to say the least.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're definitely the problem. You and I, we baked it in, I think, very nicely to Stockholm World Water Week. But, the construct of catalytic communities, and we continue to push on that and have actually made progress, which, as I look at what's the value of these events? We talked about getting together and crafting new things to do together. There was a lot that came out of Stockholm World Water Week, and we wound up launching Water United in the Colorado River Basin. But what's your take on catalytic communities? Do you see it applying to the work that you're doing and the work that you and I might do going forward? Really anywhere in the world. So what's your big takeaway? Is this like something new, or is it something old with a new name? Not to put words in your mouth, Richard. But.
I think it's something that could be genuinely new. Of course, depends on the application, but I'm really excited about the idea of catalytic communities and catalytic collaboration and figuring out. I mean, maybe to answer your question, I think maybe more work needs to be done to identify the truly novel aspects of catalytic communities, and have some sort of framework to structure them around, to make sure that it's not just an old thing with a new name, right? But I think the ideas of like systems thinking, the continuous learning aspects, and also the bringing together unusual suspects, which we did for a session at World Water Week, right? Like those core principles, I think, tremendous potential, and they've already been applied, as you know, in certain ways. But
that's great. I really appreciate your candor and transparency. I sort of baited you into that a little bit, but and now you have me thinking about, okay, great. So I can pull you in, maybe kicking and screaming, to add greater granularity to what we've started and continue to build out. I think there's a lot that you can bring in terms of what you're doing in Canada right now with Indigenous communities and collaboration and, reconciliation, basically, which is, absolutely spot on, the right word to use.
I would jump into that work willingly and enthusiastically. Applying it to the ideas of reconciliation and those processes would be super interesting. And also just a bigger question that I wondered about since Stockholm World Water Week is just the public sector and their role in these catalytic communities conversation. Because on the one hand, as we know, not very agile, quite risk averse often, but it's hard to ignore just the resources and the scale of public sectors, and also, control over policy levers and regulations and those things that really matter. And so I want to explore that topic as well as, I think catalytic communities and collaboration, there's a question around what's the role in those processes for the creation of policy, if that's part of it. And then another part of it is, there's a lot of things that government doesn't need to be doing and probably should be doing in terms of innovation in the water sector. But of course, they can enable those things to happen. So the role of the public sector in supporting catalytic communities that are not policy focused.
This is a really interesting issue and challenge, because I agree with you. The public sector has an enormous impact. It is slow to innovate and do something different beyond the status quo. But once you engage the public sector and get them on board, so to speak, they have the scale and size to really change things rather dramatically. And it's interesting. There's more to discuss on this topic, but increasingly I've been speaking to the private sector on engagement in public policy. And there seems to be more and more of an appetite with respect to water to start a dialogue and really have the private sector proactively engage with the public sector on things like water efficiency, water reuse, aquifer recharge, and so on. But, that's the optimist in me speaking. But I do believe it's a huge opportunity.
I feel that. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think I'd categorize myself as necessarily an optimist, but I think I'm optimistic about what you just said, because I agree. I mean, what we've definitely seen in Canada, but around the world as well, in recent years especially, is the severity and the frequency of water crises, we can call them climate water crises, whether it's wildfires, drought, flooding, whatever it is taxing governments beyond capacity. There's not even enough time to respond and recover from one crisis to the next. And that's tragic, and that many people have been affected by that. The silver lining is the old adage: don't let a good crisis go to waste, right? And I think it has spurred, I think, novel thinking in the public sector, and certainly we focus on working directly with elected leaders. So the chiefs and the mayors and the provincial ministers and those folks, more of an appetite, I think, to break with the status quo and to try different things, because it's so apparent that if you don't do that, you're never going to catch up.
Yeah, completely agree with you. All right. Well, one of my goals this year, and, there's plenty of time left in the year, is to turn you into a full-blown optimist. That's a little bit of a joke.
Well, you're an inspiration in that regard. I know you've described yourself as a raging optimist. So,
well, I believe that, or I've convinced myself over the years that that's probably a good tag for me in the scheme of things. Persisting and really trying to change the world. But I put you in that category, so take it as a compliment. So, Richard, where do you see yourself going now that you've been bitten by the water sector and weaving that into something that you obviously believe in terms of engaging and creating a better world with Indigenous communities?
I see myself definitely continuing in the space. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning, kind of feeling like, as a non-Indigenous Canadian, having this moral imperative to figure out these challenges, right? And so I continue to want to work in that space and on these issues of policy processes and how law and policy is constructed, and that all of the power is basically centralized and jealously guarded by existing states and institutions. I want to break that open. So that's something that interests me a lot. And yeah, the water sector, I mean, like, I don't see myself leaving as well. I think that the synthesis is really nice. And we talked about, dominant paradigms and discourses changing. Mm-hmm. I feel very lucky to be in the water sector at this moment. And you would be able to speak to it with much more experience than myself. But it really feels like water is on the agenda in a way that it was not in the past, and related to climate, but also just water as a foundation of economic security and everything. It's really a good place to be.
Well, welcome to the party.
Thank you.
I'll follow up with you. Richard, thanks so much for being on Distilled. This is a great conversation. Always great to talk to you. So, let's follow up. We will map out what we can do together.
All right. I love
thank
it.
You.
Thanks.
All right. Good deal. Take care of yourself.
You as well. Take care.